Both sides want to cut the other out of sensitive areas of their supply chain. It's about trying to decouple from one another in such a way as to realize in the long term dominance. Both sides wanted to cajole one another into negotiations so that they could pull back from a very, very dangerous situation. If we close our eyes to that and pretend that this isn't going on, I think we could end up in a lot of trouble.
Has the United States overplayed its hand with China? As the two sides agree on a major de-escalation in their tariff dispute, many are wondering who actually holds the cards. To discuss this, I'm joined now by author and economist George Magnus. George, thank you so much for being with us. China's retaliation to Trump's tariffs was much stronger than many had expected. As someone who studied China under Xi Jinping for many years, were you surprised by the boldness of the response?
I don't think so. I think of all the countries that appeared on that infamous list in the Rose Garden back in April on so-called Liberation Day, China was the one country that stood out where I think, most people said they're not going to like this and they're not going to take very kindly to what they regarded and actually said later was what they regarded as Trump's bullying, posture with regards to tariffs and all the kind of trade things that were going on at the time. So I don't think it was very surprising. The irony is, when all is said and done, we are back now where we were at the very beginning, in other words, just before Liberation Day, at the same sort of tariff. So if the Chinese had never retaliated, they'd still be in the same position that they are today. But a lot of water has flown under the bridge, and maybe unnecessarily, and just causing disruption, really.
Absolutely. You do wonder what it was all for. Chinese goods, as you said, will now face a 30% tariff. Is this a level where they can stay competitive in the long term?
Well, it's manageable compared with, it's not great, let me say, but it's manageable compared with what would have otherwise been the case, which is where you have tariff levels being levied on each other, US and China, at over 100% or over 120%. That's not really a trade war anymore. That's a trade embargo. And we already had quite strong anecdotal information on both sides, actually. American financial markets went into meltdown, as people remember quite well now. And so that could have had quite deleterious effects on the US economy. And we already know that China's export orders in April dropped to their lowest levels since the slump in COVID in 21-22. And so that was threatening tens of millions of jobs in China's coastal provinces. So it was, my view about this really was not a question about who was going to blink, but really that both sides wanted to cajole one another into negotiations so that they could pull back from a very, very dangerous situation. Because obviously, if nothing had been done, the economic circumstances would have been awful, and they could have spilled into much more dangerous security areas, for example, Taiwan or South China Sea. So it's good news in a way. I emphasize in a way that they have pulled back from the brink, and hopefully, the 90 days pause will pass and tariffs won't go back up to levels that they were just at.
They are expected to hold further talks now. Beyond seeking a commitment to buy more American goods, what kind of concessions will Trump's team realistically be able to get, and what might they have to offer in return?
Well, I think you're quite right about purchase commitments. This was really the sort of central plank of the so-called Phase One deal, which the Trump administration negotiated with China way back in kind of 2017-18, which was never really delivered on because the intervention of COVID and just sort of lack of compliance and so on and so forth. So purchase commitments is certainly one thing. Fentanyl is another. The most senior Chinese representatives at the talks in Geneva over the weekend were not just the Xi Jinping's economic czar, He Lifeng, but also Wang Xiaofeng, who is the sort of security czar, and would have had a brief to talk about fentanyl chemicals and things that the Americans keep asking the Chinese to do in order to slow down or restrict the flow of chemicals to eventually to the United States. So I think that will be probably part of whatever the negotiations and talks coming up are going to be. There could be other things as well. So, there are lots of things that the Americans and the Chinese obviously, don't agree about. But I think backing away from these sort of extreme levels of high tariffs, purchase commitments, allowing some sort of trade to resume, even though it may be at higher tariff levels than existed at the end of last year, and all that kind of environment of more restrictive trade is just something I think we have to get used to. But there could be other things, as I said, especially including fentanyl.
One issue that I feel is continuously overlooked when we look at America's trade relationships is the distinction between goods and services. Now, the US has a big deficit in the trade of goods, but generally has a surplus in services. Is this an area that's likely to come up in further discussions between Washington and Beijing?
It might be. I think the American position would certainly be that, they would welcome opening up of Chinese service producing industries to American firms. They might also want to talk about the valuation of the Chinese currency, the yuan. They might want to talk about, just market access, which has been a kind of a bugbear for as long as anybody can remember. So the charge for listeners' benefit is that China withholds access to foreign firms to its own markets in certain areas, not just in technology and goods. I mean, that's obviously quite common. Everybody does this nowadays, but also in terms of services where domestic firms have kind of preferential treatment. American financial firms will certainly be very keen to be allowed to build out some of the asset management and investment banking operations that China has welcomed them to do in the mainland. So, services could potentially be an area where very little has actually been done up until now, and that could be part of the negotiations. But I think it's fair to say there's a lot of bad blood that's kind of built up between the two sides over the years, and particularly over the course of this year. So it's going to take quite a big effort, I think, to try to cool things down a little bit.
Yeah, I'm also wondering about the time frame, because these were all issues that were supposed to be part of phase two of that trade deal during Trump's first administration, and we never really got to that point. We have 90 days now. Is that enough to be able to come to some sort of agreement on some of these much more complex topics like currency, market access, intellectual property, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of trade specialists and trade negotiators would say, all you can really do in a month or two or whatever it is, 3 months, is sketch out an outline of where you want to try to get to. Maybe you can put some hard stuff in there as well in terms of actionable events or things that people can be held accountable for, like buying more grain or buying more LNG, liquefied natural gas, or whatever it happens to be. But the rest of it, usually takes a lot longer to try to smooth out and to try to overcome a lot of not just the kind of physical barriers like in tariffs, but actually the non-tariff barriers, which are particularly onerous. For example, procurement rules and regulations, below market borrowing, which I think is a charge levied often at the Chinese government, and the way it favors domestic firms and state enterprises. So these non-tariff barriers, would take a long time, I think, for discussions to take place. So I don't think we should be getting carried away about what might be possible in the next 90 days. But I suppose coming from a low base and from a very unfortunate position in the first place. If dialogue can continue, and if the current tariff regime, which they penciled out or announced on the beginning of this week, can survive for a little while, I think nevertheless, even though that's a worse situation than we had before, it'll probably be, relatively speaking, satisfactory.
There seems to be bipartisan consensus in the United States that China's dominance in areas like semiconductors and AI needs to be contained. Are tariffs an effective tool to achieve that goal? And if not, what are the alternatives?
Well, I mean, this is a very contentious point, which, I mean, a lot of mainstream economic thinking is very hostile to the idea of tariffs in the first place, notwithstanding the fact that tariffs have actually quite a colorful history, not just for the United States going back to the 19th century, but also for Europe as well, and for many other countries. Normally, we kind of feel a little bit different about sectoral tariffs, which, for example, would be those that might apply to aspects of like chips, semiconductors, aspects of, maybe AI, quantum computing, many of the kind of national security related areas that we all get very kind of anxious about nowadays. So sectoral tariffs actually have a bit more going for them than these kind of generalized tariffs like Trump's 10% baseline tariff, which is generally regarded, I think, as something that's a little bit, beyond the pale. Because it's kind of much more overtly protectionist. I mean, it's all about protectionism, and the Chinese have been practicing this in their own way for about 10 years. So in a way, Trump is a bit of a latecomer, and as has been commented, I think, by a number of think tanks. There are about 40 or 50 major trading countries that have all adopted so-called trade defense measures against what they regard as unfair Chinese trade practices. So, the previous system wasn't working that well, actually. And obviously, the way in which things have worked out during the course of the last 3 or 4 months has been shocking in a way for its volatility and for its randomness. But we've kind of ended up at a place, probably, where tariffs on China levied by the United States will be high relative to what they were before. Tariffs on Europe and on other countries will be much lower. I mean, the UK-US agreement potentially, suggests that there is, some scope for compromise. So, the end game really, or the Endstation, so to speak, is probably where the Americans wanted to kind of end up. Though the route for getting there, I mean, it could have been better, let's put it like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we look at this in the context of a broader reordering of global trade and the quite common perception that perhaps Chinese trade practices are unfair on a global level, I'm wondering where that leaves countries that are in the middle of a trading relationship between the United States and China. If we take Vietnam or Cambodia, for example, which re-export a lot of Chinese products to the US and beyond. In that context, which side are they more afraid of angering?
Well, this is a very interesting kind of, intermediate area, because obviously it takes the focus away from bilateral trade between the United States and China. The Chinese have actually been using countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, India, Thailand, for example, to so-called transship products to the United States and to other Western countries. In other words, if we look at recent trade data, for example, Chinese exports have been very strong, not to the United States. They've actually been falling, as one would expect. But Chinese exports to other countries, to third countries, have been quite robust, which reflects the methods used by firms to bypass tariffs and bypass, the bilateral restraints on trade that exist between the two big powers. So that's really a kind of a bone of contention. for the United States as well. And arguably, Trump's reciprocal tariffs are aimed at putting leverage on countries like Vietnam and India and so on to not only reach different sorts of trade arrangements with the United States, but arrangements that are more partial to the US and less partial to China, particularly when it comes not just to commerce and trade, but also to investment as well, foreign direct investment. So the Americans boast that they're having negotiations with umpteen numbers of different countries. So far, the only one that they've announced any kind of minimal details about is the rearrangement with the United Kingdom. So we'll see what happens in kind of weeks and months to come as to when any of these other arrangements actually come to fruition and what the content in those trade agreements would be. But I think the Chinese might be quite worried about these in case countries are or feel compelled to reach agreements with the United States, which will not be for China's favor.
How could agreements like that look, though? Because I'm wondering if the United States comes to Vietnam and says, we will drop our tariffs on you if you restrict imports of Chinese components or even Chinese finished products. Is that something that a country like Vietnam can afford to do?
I think it's going to be kind of horses for courses, really. I mean, as I said before, there are a number of countries that have instituted or implemented trade defense mechanisms against. I mean, mostly they happen to be in things like steel and light manufacturing, which are the kinds of areas that a lot of emerging and middle income countries are trying to build up their expertise in and their capacity. Obviously, this is not really kind of high tech necessarily, which is much more a problem or an issue amongst developed market economies. Some countries I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, but some countries may be prepared to reach trade agreements or trade arrangements with the United States in which they will be kind of swaying around a little bit in the middle, maybe not lurching to one side or the other, but actually slightly more partial to the United States, slightly less partial towards China. There could be tariffs, there could be other kind of trade restraints or restrictions. There could be a demand or a discussion about extra vigilance and scrutiny about supply chain integrity, which was a feature in the US-UK negotiations, seemingly. So there are a number of things that are kind of potentially up for grabs here. Would be difficult to kind of prejudge it until we know how all of these arrangements are going to kind of end up.
I want to take a longer view of the US-China trade deficit now, because during Trump's first term, we had this phase one of a trade deal, which committed Beijing to buying substantially more American goods. Then, during Biden's term, we had the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. If we look at the numbers, we actually saw the US deficit with China decrease overall in those Biden years, with an especially big dip between 2022 and 2023. It's lower now than it was when Trump left office in 2020. Why then has this become the defining issue for his administration?
You're absolutely right that the bilateral deficit is narrower, and actually that the Chinese share of American imports and the American share of Chinese imports is much reduced from what it was, say, 7 to 10 years ago. But the problem is that the overall size of China's surplus hasn't really diminished. In fact, it's going up and up all the time. And the overall size of America's deficit isn't diminishing either. It's going up as well, which is exactly what you'd expect. And the reason that this is happening is because tariffs and the kind of trade politics which pervades the relationship between the United States and China can change and does change the regional distribution of surpluses and deficits, but it doesn't change the big picture. Because the big picture, when it comes to overall trade balances, is really down to what happens domestically in the United States economy and in the Chinese economy. And what happens between them in terms of trade surpluses and deficits is really just really a little bit like shuffling the deck chairs around. And what you end up with, of course, is a kind of an allusion really to what we were talking about is, that the goods just basically reach their destination, but through much more complicated routes. In other words, they may go and be assembled, for example, like Apple has announced that it's going to assemble its iPhones in India. So obviously, China's export of Apple phones to the United States are going to drop because whilst it's exporting components to India, the assembly is being done in India, so they'll be recorded as India's exports to the United States. So that's really what this is all about. The bilateral changes in the surpluses and deficits are, yes, the result of trade politics and tariffs and so on. But actually, the overall balances don't really change that much unless domestic policies are addressed as well, which hasn't obviously happened so far.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I want to ask you next. We hear so much about consumption in China being notoriously low, and I want to understand why this is. Is it because of inequality that much of the Chinese population is simply too poor to spend money, or is it more of a cultural phenomenon that Chinese people simply choose to save more?
Well, the proximate causes for uh, why China's consumption rate is relatively low. So, I mean, the private consumption proportion of China's economy is about 40% plus or minus, and that compares with some of its peer group, let's say Thailand, Mexico, these kind of middle income countries, where the consumption share is up in the 60s or even the low 70s. Certainly in lots of developed countries, it is as well. So why is that? So the proximate reasons have to do, as you say, possibly with inequality, possibly with the fact that high wage jobs in manufacturing and construction are declining. And, there's been a surge in jobs in the gig economy with no formal labor contracts, no real protection for wages or pensions or anything like that. And just the kind of low levels of profitability of Chinese firms, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of proximate reasons why that's so. But fundamentally, the reason that the consumption rate in China is so low is because the investment rate, which is its kind of mirror image, is so high. And the reason that that's so high is because China's economic model is geared towards industrial policy and exports and keeping kind of resources flowing to local governments, which are the agents of providing goods and services to local people and property and so on and so forth. And so this model basically from the model is derived this kind of phenomenon of a relatively low share of consumption. Now, it can be changed. There's no question about it. And economists, both outside of China and inside of China, are well aware about how this could be done. The trouble is that it has to be done in a way which would effectively redistribute economic power and with it political power to households and to private firms. And that's not something which Xi Jinping is very happy to do. The Communist Party really finds this, I was going to say distasteful, but it's just not in their script to do that.
I'm fascinated by much of what you said just there. And I want to go back to what you mentioned with the gig economy and the lack of protections for pensions and wages and so on. This seems very inconsistent with conventional or orthodox ideas of socialism. How do you square that? What kind of economic system is this?
Well, one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party is quite opposed to is the idea of welfare as we understand it, certainly in Europe. And they do have a fairly ubiquitous pension system. I mean, most people are covered by pensions. There are three different kind of types of systems which they have, but the pension system is ubiquitous, but it's not very generous. Healthcare is widely available, healthcare insurance and healthcare expenses, but out-of-pocket expenses for Chinese citizens are amongst the highest in the world if you want to have operations or you want to have healthcare which isn't covered. And of course, there are 250, 280 million migrant workers, many of whom don't have urban registration, who aren't covered by social welfare, free education, free schooling, free healthcare, etc. in urban areas because they don't have the right credentials. So there's a lot in the kind of structure of the Chinese state which mitigates against what we would regard as normal practice when it comes to welfare and social assistance. So again, the question is, could the Communist Party change that? And the answer is, of course they could. And then the question is, well, why don't they? That is a conundrum. Why don't they indeed?
You mentioned local borrowing as well. I'm wondering how that works. Is it a case that the central government is printing a whole lot of money, which it then directs to local authorities to spend on building roads and bridges, and that money is then not effectively invested? What fundamentally is the problem when it comes to borrowing on a local level in China?
Yes, pretty much it is. Because, I mean, obviously, a lot of people have kind of made a big deal or a big case, really, about the fact that China's debt to GDP rate is, 340% or something like that. I don't think, from an economic point of view, I mean, there's nothing terribly magical about any particular number. Obviously, it could be extremely high, but at 340 or 320 or 290 or whatever it might be. In and of itself, that's not the issue. The issue is that local governments and state enterprises, but particularly local and provincial governments, have reached a point where they almost can't borrow. They do keep on borrowing. They are allowed to keep doing this, but the central government in Beijing is not very happy with them to basically have a kind of a pink ticket or a pink slip, to willy-nilly carry on borrowing for with gay abandon. It's just not something they approve of now because the debt capacity of carrying the debt and paying debt service for local and provincial governments is compromised for an awful lot of the 32 provinces in China. Not all of them. Some of them are, relatively speaking, in much better position, but many of them are severely compromised. So the central government is quite anxious to not contain necessarily, but restrict the ability of local governments to borrow money. The local governments desperately need to make up new sources of revenue because they're not getting as much coming in from the property market and from land sales, which they've tended to rely on. The central government doesn't really want to use its own balance sheet to try to bail them out. And yet, when we look at the kind of the fiscal or the budgetary accounts of the Chinese state sector, revenue, there's like everywhere else, there's an insatiable demand for the government to spend more money, whether it's on defense or on, infrastructure or, property or whatever it happens to be. But the revenue base is really contracting because domestic demand is weak and because prices are barely rising. So the weakness of revenues in China actually speaks to the demand or the requirement that there should be pretty comprehensive tax reform. Only about 5% of China's tax revenues come from income tax. Many people that should be paying it don't. And it's a very, very regressive system which penalizes consumption because of the very high rates or widespread payments of value-added taxes, for example. But these are all like, what is to be done? There are so many things that really are failing China's economic model. Yes, of course, it's got a hugely well-known modern sector, that it's dynamic in, electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and quantum computing and AI, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a relatively small part of China's economy. The bulk of the economy is not in such a favorable condition at all. And And that's really what I think a lot of people are kind of waiting and urging the government to try to take more seriously.
And how would meaningful reform look? You've mentioned the potential of higher taxes. How else would it look?
Well, I think, I feel like I'm kind of whistling Dixie here because I'm going to give you a kind of a list of things which are just not going to happen. But, the starting point really is if the relatively low share of consumption in the economy and the relatively restricted openness of the service industries, if both of these things are the other side of the coin of China's industrial policies and its basic beliefs that if they get industrial policy right, prosperity will kind of trickle down to the rest of the citizenship, then if you want to change that because it's not really working, you really have to do root and branch changes and change the model. You have to change ownership structures. You have to change what public authorities like local governments and provincial governments, what they're allowed to provide to people in terms of goods and services, which means they have to be funded better, which means that the central government has to be more generous and open up its balance sheet to other demands. You have to abandon maybe the household registration system so that 270, 280 million migrant workers get access to local goods and services. There are so many things that could be done to improve and change the structure of China's economy. But so far, these are things which the government has been prepared to kind of tweak and try to, tinker around the edges, but not really embrace in a kind of wholehearted way, because I think it does involve a redistribution of power, which they're not really interested to participate in.
If we take that example of, improving rights and conditions for migrant workers, is the genuine concern there that they would seek a greater political freedom, greater say in Chinese society?
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that if you empower people economically by giving them, access to higher income, wealth, ownership of small enterprises or property or land or whatever it happens to be. If you empower people economically, usually the handmaiden is that you are in effect transferring political power with that economic power as well. And as I said, that is something which is anathema to the CCP, to the Chinese Communist Party. They do not want to share power, and they want to remain in it.
So interesting. I want to look at the United States now and what is going on there domestically when it comes to borrowing. Now, Trump's initial tariff announcement caused a big reaction on the bond markets, and for the first time, really, the fragility of American borrowing entered mainstream discussion. How much of a risk does this erratic tariff policy pose for the US economy?
Well, yeah, and I want to kind of emphasize, I don't think tariffs per se, they're not great. I mean, most economists would say, you know, that it's not an optimal way of, conducting yourself in terms of international trade, and it has costs, and you run the risk that you protect companies at home which don't deserve protection, et cetera, et cetera. So theoretically, we as a profession in economics, we're not really enamored with tariffs, but there is a place for them, and they're not necessarily terminal. I think what is very damaging for the United States is the manner in which the Trump administration has implemented tariffs erratically, randomly, prone to hike them, pull them back down again. I mean, this just adds to a lot of uncertainty for businesses, which, have pretty, they're probably clueless really about where they should be, essentially anchoring their commercial interests and planning their trade, planning their investment, planning their production. So not good for business, I would say, and also clearly that, very, very high tariffs, obviously not good for consumers either. And to the extent that they damage confidence in financial markets, which, okay, maybe things have come back a little bit now, and we're not really in sort of ground zero territory that we were in a few weeks ago, where the dollar, the bond market, the equity market were all in a deep funk. Um, so that kind of financial damage, if sustained, can also have a potentially very, very alarming impact on consumer confidence and on the willingness of consumers and businesses to spend money. So I would say that to the extent that Trump has kind of pulled back from those extreme positions that he occupied a little time ago, obviously the financial markets have recovered, and probably, the likelihood that we would attribute to a recession this summer has probably dropped as a consequence. Um, but this is not something that policymakers should basically toy with in the way that we've seen. I mean, if you have a plan to do this, that's fine. Communicate it well, stick to the plan, explain it to people. Everybody knows what's going on. The rules are the rules. But this kind of volatility is something which is really damaging.
Well, I think fundamentally there's just a lot of confusion about what Trump wants. On the one hand, a strong dollar is bad for American exports. That seems like something he wants to avoid. On the other, a weak dollar, as we saw, reflects a loss of trust in American borrowing. Is there some magical middle ground that he's trying to achieve here?
I'm not really sure. I mean, as I said, I think the sort of it's questionable. I mean, well, let me rephrase that. I think we know that he is enamored with the idea of tariffs. He thinks that there, and not just he. I mean, obviously the right in the United States and the think tanks that basically kind of exist in that space think that it can be a tool to exercise leverage over other countries. It can be a source of revenues and somewhat pushing the boat out. It can be, they say, a vehicle with which to reindustrialize the United States. Now, all of these things have been mentioned. The reindustrialization argument, I think, is pretty tenuous. Nobody's going to bring back knocking widgets into blocks or doing low value manufacturing in the United States. They don't need that. They don't want that. What they really need is kind of modern manufacturing, which is increasingly robotic, automatic, et cetera, et cetera. But so the reindustrialization in the way that people understand it, I think, is a bridge too far. The revenue side of the argument, I think, is also somewhat weak, to be honest. I mean, the only thing that I think, if there is a plan, um, and it's questionable, I mean, certainly in terms of method, but if there is a plan, it is to recalibrate global supply chains away from China. In other words, we want to do our own rare earth processing. We don't want to rely on China. The Chinese want to be able to build their own aircraft without having to import American know-how and American jet engines or whatever it is that goes into their commercial, domestically produced aircraft. So this self-reliance thing is basically a two-way process. Both sides want to cut the other out of sensitive areas of their supply chains. And I think that's, as I said, the Chinese have been doing this since at least since 2010, 2015. The Americans are a little bit kind of latecomers, but Chips and Science Act and Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, were basically, the Biden administration's attempts to try to, score some of their own points in trying to become a little bit more self-reliant and get foreign companies or American companies to invest back in the United States rather than in China or other countries.
Would it be a fair prediction then to say that the whole world is likely to become a little bit more Chinese when it comes to its economic policy?
That's not an unfair way to put it, I would say. I mean, I don't think that I don't think the world is going to kind of copy, the Chinese model to the letter. But if you said that, for example, the Chinese have over a decade had a policy of self-reliance and building up market share for the domestic companies, you could not argue that that was not really the goal of the United States. And, perhaps even Europeans actually share some of those aspirations as well. And it is, on the one side, to de-Americanize Chinese supply chains. On the other side, it is to de-Sinify Chinese supply chains. So, both sides, I think, not necessarily when we're talking luxury goods or, toys and textiles or basic materials or simple, products. I don't think anybody has an issue really about what sort of exchange goes on there. I mean, not really. There may be issues about, government subsidies and behind the border trade restrictions and so on. But the main things that people get really excited about, of course, are energy, technology, dual purpose products and machinery. In other words, civilian products that have military applications. Anything that we basically want to bunch under the term national security is really sort of a little bit kind of verboten now in terms of letting either the Americans or the Chinese into the picture. And I think that is just the way things are going to be. And I think the battle really, or the struggle, I think, is going to be for the United States and China to have kind of spheres of commercial influence where together they are stronger than they are individually. And that's, I think, really where the trade and commercial agenda is going to be for the foreseeable future.
Am I right to interpret your tone as quite sanguine when it comes to this reordering, this increasing self-reliance? Do you think this is a necessary response to the hyper-globalization that we've seen in the past few decades?
I think I wouldn't say, well, I was going to say it's not necessary, but I think it follows directly from the core nature of the adversarial relationship between the United States and China. So obviously, from a Chinese point of view, and they are very keen to include their own history in their narrative. From a Chinese point of view, the Americans have essentially had it their own way for too long. They don't like the idea of an American-dominated, global trading system. They don't like the idea of a dollar-based finance system, which gives so much power to American banks and to the US Treasury. They want to change the global governance system, not in the way that Putin's Russia might, but they want to change it in such a way that the influence of China is increased and the interests of China are better represented in the way in which international institutions and organizations work, in the way that standards, beliefs, values are implemented and adhered to. Okay, but that's exactly what the United States and the Western world wants as well. So this kind of adversarial standoff really is, I think, the root of why we are kind of separating from one another by degrees or, in lurches. I mean, I know it's not a very popular word, but you could call it, and, the US Treasury Secretary denied in Geneva over the weekend that decoupling was really anything that either side wanted or favored. But to call a spade, that's exactly what it's about. It's about trying to decouple from one another in such a way as to realize in the long term dominance. And I think we need to understand that that's really what it's about. If we close our eyes to that and pretend that this isn't going on, I think we could end up in a lot of trouble.
George Magnus, it has been fascinating listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.